Hi there, my incredible family, welcome. Before we dive into a story that will tug at your heartstrings and leave you breathless, I want to take a moment to thank each and every one of you for joining me. Your support means the world, and I promise you, this tale is worth every second. Now prepare yourselves, because sometimes the greatest gifts come in the most unexpected and seemingly cruel packages. With a cruel smirk, his mother presented the rusty Beetle key, a symbol of their disdain. Little did they know, this worn-out car wasn't an insult. It was the quiet roar of a love they couldn't comprehend, a love about to ignite a $150 million legacy. The Florida sun, usually a comforting warmth, felt like a harsh spotlight on Mary's face as she stood at Clark's graveside. Her simple black dress, borrowed and slightly too tight around her burgeoning belly, stood in stark contrast to the tailored suits and silk dresses of the Smith family. They moved in a huddle, a wall of polished grief that seemed to subtly push her to the periphery. Mary, a young black woman with eyes that held an ocean of unshed tears, clutched a single wilting rose. Each whisper from Clark's relatives felt like a sting, their glances sharp, laden with judgment and an unspoken accusation. She was an outsider, always had been in their eyes, despite Clark's fierce devotion. Her emotional need was simple: to mourn her husband in peace, to feel a connection to the man she loved, but their disdain created a chasm of loneliness around her. Miles away, in a sprawling, sterile office building, Clark's older brother, Richard Smith, paced impatiently. His phone was glued to his ear, his voice tight with a tension that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with numbers. Richard, sharp-suited and outwardly successful, was driven by a deep-seated insecurity, a constant need to prove himself worthy of his family's name, especially to his domineering mother. The funeral was a mere obligation, a checkmark on his schedule. His emotional state was one of barely contained anxiety. A looming business deal threatened to unravel, jeopardizing his carefully constructed facade of control. He saw Clark's marriage to Mary as a reckless act, a stain on their pristine family image. And now, Clark's death was nothing but an inconvenient loose end. As he hung up, a notification flashed across his screen, a reminder for the family gift presentation at the post-funeral gathering. He sighed, already dreading the performance, especially the part involving Clark's poor widow. Their paths, so intertwined by blood and now by loss, were about to collide in a spectacular, emotionally charged fashion. The air in the Smith family's opulent living room was thick with a cloying sweetness of lilies and hypocrisy. Mary sat on the edge of a velvet armchair, her hands resting protectively over her swollen belly. She watched, a silent observer, as Mrs. Smith, Clark's mother, glided through the room, her voice a practiced melody of sorrow and command. Then came the moment everyone, especially Mary, had been anticipating with a knot of dread. Mrs. Smith paused, a calculated smile playing on her lips as she addressed the room. "And now," she announced, her gaze flicking dismissively to Mary, "for our dear Clark's widow, we wanted to ensure she has a way to get around." From the grand double doors, two of Clark's cousins, barely suppressing snickers, wheeled in an ancient, faded, pea-green Volkswagen Beetle. It was a relic, scarred with rust spots, one headlight askew, looking as if it had been resurrected from a scrapyard. A collective titter rippled through the room, quickly stifled into polite coughs and averted gazes. But the message was clear. Mrs. Smith, holding up a single tarnished key, a theatrical flourish in her hand, laughed openly. It wasn't a kind laugh, but a sharp, cutting sound that sliced through the fragile silence. "A vintage classic, wouldn't you say, Mary?" she purred, the mockery thinly veiled. Mary felt the blood drain from her face, then surge back, hot with humiliation. Her vision blurred, not from tears, but from a fierce, burning indignation that ignited deep within her. It was a physical blow, worse than any spoken insult. She could feel the stares, the judgment, the cruel triumph in their eyes. Every fiber of her being screamed to lash out, to throw the key back, but she merely rose, her movements slow and deliberate. She walked towards the car, a defiant grace in her step, and took the key from Mrs. Smith's outstretched hand, her fingers brushing against the cold metal. Her touch was steady, though inside a storm raged. "Thank you," she said, her voice a soft whisper that carried surprising weight, "for your generosity." The words were a shield, a silent promise to herself that this moment, this profound humiliation, would not break her. Richard, watching from a distance, felt a flicker of something akin to shame, quickly suppressed by a renewed sense of irritation at Mary's sheer presence. The Beetle, a symbol of ridicule to them, had just become, for Mary, a vessel of quiet, burning resolve. Mary retreated from the suffocating grandeur of the Smith mansion as quickly as dignity allowed. The worn Beetle, somehow both an insult and her only escape, sputtered to life with a reluctant cough, mirroring the tremor in her own spirit. As she drove away, the taunting laughter of the in-laws echoed in her mind, a relentless drumbeat of shame and anger. Tears finally unleashed blurred the already cracked windshield. She gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles ached, repeating Clark's name like a mantra against the rising tide of bitterness. How could they? How could they humiliate her, his wife, the mother of his child, with such callous cruelty? Back in the mansion, Richard found himself in his mother's study, the scent of expensive whiskey and stale cigar smoke hanging heavy in the air. He tried to dismiss the incident with a shrug. "It was a bit much, Mother, even for you." But the words felt weak, hollow. His mother, however, was unrepentant, her face a mask of self-satisfaction. "She needed to be reminded of her place, Richard. That girl was never one of us. And now, with Clark gone, there's no need to pretend." Richard knew, deep down, that his mother's animosity towards Mary stemmed from Clark's unwavering love for her, a choice his mother saw as an affront to their family's standing. He himself felt a peculiar mix of relief and unease. Relief that the outsider was now definitively out, but unease at the sheer brutality of his family's methods. He wanted to detach, to immerse himself in his business dealings, to forget the image of Mary's quiet dignity as she took the key. He clung to the familiar narrative. Mary was a gold digger, a disruption, and now a problem solved. But a tiny, inconvenient voice in the back of his mind questioned if it was truly that simple. The Beetle, rattling away into the distance, had created an uncomfortable ripple in the carefully maintained calm of his world, a ripple he desperately wanted to ignore. Weeks later, the initial shock of the funeral had dulled into a persistent ache. Mary, now further along in her pregnancy, found solace in the quiet solitude of her small apartment, a refuge from the harsh judgment of the outside world. The Beetle, parked outside, became a strange monument to both her humiliation and her resilience. She had started cleaning it out, an almost meditative act, clearing the dust and forgotten trinkets that spoke of its previous life. It was a painstaking process, revealing layers of neglect and decay, much like her own grieving heart. She felt a strange, almost spiritual bond with the old car. It, too, was an outcast, discarded and misunderstood. The act of restoring it, piece by piece, became a symbol of her quiet determination to rebuild her own life, despite the odds. She was alone, yet she wasn't. Clark's memory and the burgeoning life within her fueled a quiet strength. Meanwhile, a critical board meeting was underway at Smith Industries, the very foundation of Richard's family's wealth. A hostile takeover bid loomed, spearheaded by a rival corporation that had been circling for months. Richard, usually unflappable, was visibly stressed. His mother, sensing the impending crisis, had called an emergency meeting, pulling in all family members with any semblance of power or shareholding. The stakes were astronomically high. Not just the company, but the very legacy and standing of the Smith name were on the line. As the intense meeting raged on, dissecting spreadsheets and legal documents, a critical patent issue came to light. A vital piece of intellectual property, integral to fending off the takeover, was vaguely referenced in old company records, but the full documentation, the crucial proof of ownership, was missing. Panic began to set in. Mrs. Smith, ever the pragmatist beneath her disdain, suddenly remembered something. Clark, he always dabbled in these obscure patents. He mentioned something once about filing for protection under a different entity. Our side project, he called it. Her eyes, sharp even in her panic, darted to Richard. He might have kept something at that little apartment, or even in that car we gave his widow. Richard felt a jolt of reluctant recognition. Clark had always been the black sheep, the dreamer, but also undeniably brilliant. He swallowed his pride. "I'll go," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "I'll talk to her." He knew this was an unpalatable task, but the future of Smith Industries depended on it. Later that afternoon, Richard found himself standing on Mary's humble porch. The contrast between her world and his own stark and almost jarring. The old Beetle, now noticeably cleaner but still unmistakably a wreck, sat in the driveway. Mary opened the door, her eyes widening slightly at the sight of him. The shock was clear on her face, but she quickly composed herself. There was no warmth, no animosity, just a weary expectation in her gaze. "Mary," Richard began, his voice stiff, accustomed to command. We believe Clark might have left some important documents. Something related to a patent. It's vital for the company." He gestured vaguely towards the Beetle. "We thought, perhaps in the car?" He offered no apology for the past, no softening of his tone, simply a desperate plea cloaked in corporate urgency. Mary looked from him to the Beetle, a flicker of suspicion in her eyes. The circumstances, so disparate yet so intertwined, had irrevocably bound them together, if only for this moment. They were reluctant allies in a search dictated by a ghost, forced to navigate the uncomfortable space between past cruelty and present necessity. Mary led Richard to the old Beetle, the silence between them heavy with unspoken history. The air around the car felt charged, a strange tension binding them together. Richard, accustomed to sleek luxury vehicles, surveyed the interior with a barely concealed grimace. "You've been cleaning it," he observed, an odd note in his voice. Mary simply nodded, her hand tracing a pattern on the dashboard, a subtle act of affection for the humble car. "It was Clark's," she stated, her voice soft but firm. A quiet reclaiming of his memory. As Mary opened the driver's side door, Richard leaned in, scanning the worn seats and glove compartment. "Clark always had a knack for hiding things," he muttered, almost to himself, a rare, unguarded moment. Used to hide his comic books from Mother in the most ridiculous places. Once, he stuffed his favorite one inside a hollowed-out dictionary. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched Mary's lips, a shared glimpse into the playful, brilliant man they both knew. It was Mary, however, whose fingers brushed against something stiff beneath the driver's seat, wedged deep into the springs. She pulled out a thick sealed envelope, its edges slightly dusty. Her heart gave a sudden hard thud against her ribs. Richard's eyes widened, a flicker of something raw and desperate crossing his face. He extended a hand, but Mary instinctively held it closer. This felt personal, not corporate. She carefully broke the seal. Inside, meticulously organized, were not just patent documents, but a stack of handwritten notes in Clark's familiar scrawl, along with share certificates for a company Mary had never heard of, Luminate, and then a personal letter addressed to her. Her gaze fell on the first line, and her breath hitched. "My dearest Mary," it read, "if you're reading this, I've likely gone on ahead. I know my family won't look after you the way they should, so I've made sure you're taken care of. This is for you and for our baby. My work on Luminatech. It was always meant to be our future. Mary's eyes scanned further, taking in details of a revolutionary energy storage technology, a secret project Clark had poured his life into. She saw her name on the ownership papers, a significant stake in this burgeoning company. Richard, peering over her shoulder, his jaw slowly dropping, recognized the names of investors, the market projections, and the sheer scale of what Clark had created. He saw the recent IPO date, the astronomical valuation. His face paled, not just from shock, but from a dawning, horrifying realization of the truth about Clark's genius and about his family's monumental, cruel error. The mystery wasn't just solved, it had exploded, revealing a fortune and a profound betrayal that intensified the conflict between them. The connection, now solidified by Clark's final gift, either strengthened or shattered under the weight of these hidden truths, depending on how they chose to react to this monumental discovery. The revelation of Luminatech's worth, laid bare in the humble Beetle, hung in the air like an electric charge. Richard, usually so composed, looked utterly shell-shocked. He ran a hand through his perfectly coiffed hair, his gaze darting from the documents to Mary's face, a complex mix of awe, regret, and something akin to fear in his eyes. Luminatech, he whispered, as if testing the name. Clark, he actually did it. He built a unicorn. Mary, however, was immersed in Clark's letter. Each word was a tender caress from beyond the grave, a testament to his foresight and boundless love. He knew, she murmured, tears finally tracking paths through the dust on her cheeks. But these were tears of profound relief and gratitude, not sorrow. He knew they would, he knew he had to protect us. She looked up at Richard. Her eyes, usually downcast or wary, now held a fierce, quiet power. He loved me. And he loved our child. It wasn't a challenge, but a statement of undeniable truth that resonated through the small car. Richard, for the first time, saw past the poor black widow and the outsider. He saw a woman of immense strength, grieving deeply, yet holding the key to a legacy that dwarfed his own carefully constructed corporate world. He saw the tangible proof of his brother's love, a love he and his family had so cruelly dismissed. He remembered Clark's quiet determination, his endless hours spent in the garage, dismissed as tinkering. A profound wave of guilt washed over him. He'd been so blind, so caught up in the family's prejudices and his own anxieties. A fragile but real bond began to form in that moment, forged in the shared ghost of Clark. Richard cleared his throat, his voice uncharacteristically soft. Clark, he always believed in you, Mary. Fiercely. He offered her a hesitant, almost awkward smile. He'd be proud. Of you. Of all this. He pointed to the documents. And of the baby. For a fleeting moment, the chasm of their past seemed to shrink. There was a shared glance, a moment of mutual understanding, perhaps even a flicker of kindness. The weight of their conflict hadn't vanished, but in the presence of Clark's love, a small tentative space for healing felt possible. It was a fragile peace, a temporary truce in the face of an overwhelming truth, but a peace nonetheless. The fragile peace shattered a mere 2 days later. The news of Luminatech's meteoric rise, now public knowledge, reached the Smith family like a venomous whisper. Richard, having cautiously tried to explain the situation to his mother, was met with a furious denial. This is a trick. A con. That girl, using Clark's memory to steal from us. Mrs. Smith stormed, her face contorted with a terrifying blend of rage and humiliation. She refused to acknowledge the documents, the clear evidence, choosing instead to believe Mary had somehow manipulated her beloved son, even in death. Driven by her mother's relentless accusations and her own wounded pride, Mrs. Smith arrived at Mary's modest apartment with Richard reluctantly in tow, her eyes blazing with an unholy fire. "You scheming little opportunist," she spat, her voice cutting through Mary's quiet afternoon. "How dare you parade this fraudulent claim? You think you can take advantage of my grieving son?" Richard stood by, his face a mask of internal conflict, unable to intervene against his mother's force. Mary, holding her swollen belly, felt a cold dread, but also a renewed surge of defiance. This was it, the battle Clark had anticipated, the one he had armed her for. Harsh words, cruel accusations, and bitter recriminations flew through the air, tearing apart any semblance of potential understanding. The bond, so tentatively formed with Richard, seemed to disintegrate under the onslaught. Mary heard her baby kick, a small, insistent beat of life, and in that instant she realized she was fighting not just for herself, but for her child's future, for Clark's legacy. "This isn't a scheme," Mary stated, her voice trembling but firm. "It's Clark's love, protecting his family. Me and our child. Something you never understood." The accusation hung in the air, potent and undeniable. This was the lowest emotional point. The trust was obliterated, and Mary questioned if true acceptance from Clark's family would ever be possible. Now Mary stood alone in her living room, the echoes of the confrontation still ringing in her ears. Richard and his mother had left in a flurry of angry threats, promising legal action. The weight of it all was immense, but a quiet strength began to settle within her. She reread Clark's letter, his words a balm to her wounded spirit. He had anticipated this. He had armed her, not just with wealth, but with the undeniable truth of his love. Pride warred with a longing for true peace, for the simple acceptance she deserved. She thought of her baby due soon, and a clear path emerged. She would not let their bitterness define her child's world. She would choose dignity, strength, and the quiet power of her truth. Days later, Richard, wrestling with his conscience, found himself unable to shake the image of Mary's dignified defiance or the undeniable evidence of Clark's brilliance and intent. His mother's rage was a hurricane, but Clark's love, etched in the documents, was an immovable mountain. He made a choice, a difficult one that would set him against his formidable mother. He reached out, not to Mary, but to his family's legal team, ensuring they understood the incontrovertible nature of Clark's will and Luminatech's legitimate ownership. He would not allow his brother's final loving act to be desecrated by his family's prejudice. The resolution arrived, not with an explosive confrontation, but with a quiet, undeniable shift in power. The legal threats from Mrs. Smith dissolved in the face of airtight documentation and Richard's unprecedented stance. Mary, now a mother to a beautiful, healthy baby boy she named Clark Jr., moved into a spacious, light-filled home, a stark contrast to her old apartment. The rusty Beetle, however, sat proudly in her new driveway, not as a symbol of past humiliation, but as a cherished vessel of love and destiny. She often found herself smiling at it, a private understanding passing between her and Clark's final gift. One afternoon, Richard appeared at her door, no longer with a request, but with an offering. He held a small, beautifully carved wooden toy, a vintage Volkswagen Beetle, precisely replicated. "For Clark Jr.," he said, his voice soft, humbled. "And, Mary, I'm truly sorry. For everything." His eyes held genuine remorse, a stark difference from the disdain she had once known. Mary looked at the toy, then at Richard, and finally at the child stirring in her arms. The bitterness still lingered, a phantom limb of her past pain, but it no longer held her captive. She extended her hand, a gesture of quiet acceptance, not forgiveness for the past, but an opening to a different future. As she held Clark Jr. later that day, whispering stories of his brilliant, loving father, Mary understood. The Beetle, once a symbol of scorn, had indeed been the vessel of her husband's final gift. Her victory wasn't just about wealth. It was about reclaiming her dignity, honoring Clark's love and raising her child not in bitterness, but in the quiet, undeniable triumph of love, justice, and unexpected connection. The echo of the Beatles' arrival at the funeral, a moment of profound humiliation, had been transformed into the quiet purr of a new beginning, a testament to enduring love and a life beautifully, powerfully remade. My dear audience, what an emotional journey that was. Did you feel Mary's strength? Did you understand Richard's transformation? And how powerful was Clark's final act of love? Share your thoughts below. I love hearing your insights. For those of you who appreciate stories of resilience and unexpected turns, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. We have many more tales that prove true love and justice always find a way. And finally, as Mary discovered, sometimes the most profound gifts are hidden in plain sight, waiting for us to uncover their true worth. What seemingly insignificant gifts in your own life have turned out to be the most valuable? Let me know in the comments.